Welcome back, friends. So in the last video, we explored a little bit about the select and manipulate process. And there we saw a select method, which is called query selector. All right. So now in this video, we're going to talk about the different ways of selecting elements using JavaScript and the DOM. But before all that, let's remember what the DOM is just one more time. So DOM is all the objects, all the representations of our elements, and they all live inside of this thing called the document object. So it's a top level object, or the root node. And if all that's not enough, well, it's also the home of all the selectors. All the methods that we're going to learn also are inside the document object. So this thing is chock full or packed, right? So we're going to unpack a little bit in this video. Every selector is going to start with document dot. All right. Now, like I said earlier, the document is an object, and these methods are inside this object. So that means to reach these methods, we're going to say document dot method name. Cool? All right. So let's have a look and see what some of these methods are. So our very first selector method is document dot get element by ID. So actually its name, I'd say, is a little self-explanatory, right? So it takes in an ID name and it's going to return the one element that matches that ID. And remember that an ID can only occur one time on a page. So here I've prepared an HTML to be able to work with these different methods. So, okay, we are going to do a couple examples, but first let's see a few other methods as well, just so I can scramble up your brain a little bit. Second method is documents.getElements by class name. And again, the name tells you exactly what it does, just like getElement by ID, although this is slightly different. GetElements plural with an S by class name, all right? So remember, a class can occur as many times as we want it to on a, well, whatever given page we have. So we pass in a string like background, and that's going to return a list of all the elements on the page that have the matching class name background. That makes sense, right? All right, so the next method is document.getElements by tag name. And of course, this one is pretty self-explanatory as well. It works just like the getElement by ID or getElements by class name, except it returns a list of elements that match a given tag name, like div or h1. All right, so our next method is document.querySelector. Now remember how we used this in the previous video? So this query selector is a newer method that hasn't existed for all that long. And our next method is document.querySelectorAll. Okay? So these are the 5 selector methods that we're going to explore the usage of. I want to point out something to you. All these methods start with, let's say it together, document dot. So why is that? Yeah, because the document is our top level object that contains all of our objects that are returned from HTML tags. Now, of course, there are many methods in addition to these objects. It's a remarkably huge object. So in the browser, once again, let's see just what it looks like. So here I'll say console.dir, and inside of it, document. And yeah, so look at this. We've got a huge object, and inside this object, there are many properties and methods. And let's go to the slide. So these methods are methods of this document object as well. These are no different from the methods that we use when learning objects. So, you ready to do some examples? I am. So first up, I'm going to use document.getElement by ID. I'm going to try to select an HTML element by using this method. So I'll go to my HTML file. And here there's a paragraph with an ID. So I'm going to select it with document.getElementById. All right, so that's the method that we're going to use. So in script.js, I'll say var select with ID because I'm going to store that element inside this variable. And it is equal to document.getElementById. And inside of it, I will write the ID of the element that I want to select in quotes. So I'll just copy this ID and paste it in here. Okay, so it's going to select this p tag that has the ID oak paragraph. All right, so it selects the object and then it returns to us, just like a carrier pigeon. I'll quickly show you that in the console, not the carrier pigeon part. So I'll say console.log select with ID. And now I can save this and go to the console. And when I refresh the page, there's the paragraph right there. So we selected something by an ID. And again, it's showing it to us as if it's actually HTML, but the result of this is actually a JavaScript object. Now to see that I write console.dir and inside of it I say select with ID. And this is exactly what it looks like. All these properties. So in other words, it's just a really nice shortcut for us to visually see what we selected, but in actuality, it's an object representation. Okay? Okay, so that's about it for document.getElementById. So we will call the method we pass in a single string argument, the name of an ID that we want, and then it goes and finds the matching element that has the same ID, and it returns the object representation to us. So now let's talk about our next method, which is document.getElementsByClassName. So of course its name tells exactly what it does. So we'll set it up just like getElementById. We'll pass in a string-like background, and that's going to return a list of all the elements on the page that have the matching class name background. So I'll go to my HTML file, and here we have two div with the class name of background, but if there were, let's say, 100 elements on the page that had the class name, we would get all 100 in a list. You follow? So now let's have a look at that in my script.js file. So I'll say var select with class, and in this variable, I want to store the list that returns from document.getElementsByClassName. And then inside of the parenthesis, I'm going to write the class name that we want to select. So I'll go to my HTML file, and here I'll copy this class name background, and paste it in here. Okay, so right now I've saved the elements with the background class in my HTML file to this select with class variable. Yeah. So to see that, I'll just say console.log and inside of select with class. Save this and go to the console. So now here, when I refresh the page, here in the console, we'll see a list of the two div, both with class equal to background. Now, technically, I don't know if you're wondering this, but perhaps, technically, this is not an array, all right? It's something called a node list, which is kind of like an array. So if that was your thought, good on you. But I like to think of it as a lightweight array, if you will. I'll explain to you why. So it comes with some of the things that you would expect from an array, but some of the more advanced features, not so much. For instance, we can access elements like this using square brackets, select with class 0. We can do select with class dot length, But we wouldn't be able to do a for each loop, all right? Because in actuality, it's not an array, it's a node list. So just like with the get element by ID, it'll show us this nice string representation, but behind the scenes, yeah, it's actually an object. Okay, so get elements by class name returns a list, not quite an array. Now it does contain every element on the page that matches the given class name that we provided. So that's all very well and good. Now let's see our next method, which is get elements by tag name. So yeah, it works very similar to get element by ID or get elements by class name, except it returns to us a list of elements that match a given tag name, like div or p. So in our HTML file, we have two h1 tags, and let's say I want to select them. So I'll go to my script.js file, and here I'll say var select with tag document.getElements by tag name and h1 in quotes. And to see the result here, I'll say console.log select with tag. So I'll save this, go to the console. I'll refresh the page, and look at that. We get this list. No, it's not an array. It's a node list, and it has two h1s, and I won't prove it to you this time, right? Because you believe me and trust me. Of course you do. And you also want to get onto something else. So this time we're not going to make console.dir, but these are objects with all those properties. So the important point here is it returns as a list. Even if there's only one element, it'll still return a list. Okay, so now let's see our next method. So it's a document.querySelector. And here we no longer have a get element or get elements by something syntax. So this is called a query selector. And of course, query selector is indeed a newer method that, well, really hasn't existed for all that long in the scheme of things. I mean, evolutionarily speaking, perhaps. But this method makes our lives a whole lot easier, and I'll show you. So we can actually use it to do everything that we just saw with the get element by ID, get elements by class name, or get elements with the tag name. We can actually replicate all of that with query selector. So what does it do? It takes a CSS style selector. So CSS style selector means just any of the selectors that we would use inside of a CSS document, right? So I'll show you an example. So I'll say var select with query equal to document.querySelector. And now inside of this, what am I going to write? The first thing we need to know about this selector is that it returns only one element, one object back to us. So you know in CSS, we can select whole HTML tags as well as just writing the HTML tag name. So here I can say just h1. And just so that you know, there are two h1 tags in our HTML document, but the selector is query selector. So it returns just one object to us every time. So that means that if there are more than one element that matches with what I write inside the parenthesis here, then the selector selects only the first element that matches that. So to see what I mean, I'll say console.log select with query. I'll save this, go to the console. And here I can refresh the page, and look at that. We see just one h1, although we have two h1 tags in our HTML file. All right, so I'll show you another example with query selector. So I'll go to my HTML file, and here we have an ID oak paragraph. Now let's select this element which has an ID. I'll copy this ID. Now I'll go to my script.js file, and here I'll paste that. And at the moment, I am selecting something based on the ID oak paragraph. So I can't just write the word oak paragraph like I did with get element by ID. What I have to do is use the CSS syntax with the hash symbol or the octathorpe and then the oak paragraph. So I'll write the hash symbol here. And that's how you select something with Query Selector. Now, if you want an ID, just like you would with CSS, and we get the p tag with ID equal to oak paragraph. So now to see what I want to change this variable name, select with Query ID, and I'll change it here as well. So I'll save this, go to console, I'll refresh the page, and yeah, there it is. So we'll see just the p tag with oak paragraph. All right, so let me show you something else. So here, I'll just copy the line and paste it here. And now I'll say var select with query class equal to document dot query selector. And this time I will use dot inside of this parenthesis to select an element with a class name. And you know we use dot in CSS to select a class, right? So now I'll go to the HTML file. I'll copy this class name, come back here and paste it. Now this is going to give us an element that has this class name. But what's important here is that it actually only gives us the very first match. So even though there are two elements that have the background as a class, it only gives us the first one. And that's the point of using a selector. It's always going to just return one element. Now, there is another method that we're going to see shortly that will return all the elements that match. I know you're jonesing for that, but we'll get to that in a minute. So to see this, I'll say console.log, select with query class, and I'll save this, go to the console, and here I'll refresh the page, and there you have it. We see only one div tag that has the background class, and it is always the first match. Okay, now, so let's see our last selector, and it is query selector all. And guess what? It works, well, exactly the same way. It takes a CSS selector, but it returns all matching elements. So let's go back to our script.js file. And I will copy this line and paste it here. I'll say var select with query all class equal to document dot query selector all and background. Now this is going to give me all the elements with the class equal to background. And to see that, I'll say console.log, and inside of it, I'll say select with query all class. I'll save this and go to the console, refresh the page, and yeah, we see all the div tags that have the background class. So once again, these are objects, right? They are not HTML. They are JavaScript objects that are constructed from this HTML. And we're not done. So this gives me a node list, just like get elements by class name. And there you are. So what do you say? Let's wrap it up. We talked about different select methods. There are 5 of them. And here's the list. So right now, why don't we take a quick break, and we will continue in the next section. I'll see you there.